Flavian-Pauline Thesis, the trans-historical, elite-class engineering of global monotheism, and its socio-economic defense. Abstract. This text presents a unified, data-supported critical historical framework, analyzing the rise of global monotheism from its institutional origins to its physical preservation. It rejects the conventional narrative of spontaneous, organic grassroots movements led by illiterate peasants. Instead, it posits that the institutional structures of Judaism and Christianity were highly strategic, elite-funded, and technologically innovative administrative campaigns. Operating under the explicit mechanics of immigrant enclave theory, middleman-minority capitalization, and social capital conversion, these corporate-style movements were engineered by marginalized elites to capture, insulate, and manage massive demographic crises among displaced populations. By weaponizing cutting-edge book technology and executing aggressive text-on-text narrative warfare, these elite-class operators systematically converted commercial wealth into absolute, transcontinental socio-spiritual and legal monopolies. 1. The historical archetype. The 6th century BCE Babylonian enclave precedent. The elite class engineering, textual manipulation, and economic mechanics of the 1st century Christian movement were not an original historical anomaly. They were a direct, systemic scaling of a logistical blueprint perfected during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. Cuneiform clay data from the Al-Yahudu tablets, 572–477 BCE, proves that when Nebuchadnezzar deported the Judean population, the literate administrative elites did not enter labor camps. They established a highly organized ethnic enclave economy, managing the town's internal economy through Akkadian cuneiform legal frameworks. These elite scribes controlled land leases, grain sales, and tax collections for the Babylonian crown, effectively insulating the group's internal assets. Nearly 900 cuneiform tablets from the Murashu banking house, 455–403 BCE, reveal that elite Jewish families transitioned into powerful international financiers, landowners, and imperial tax collectors. Operating as middleman-minority entrepreneurs, these elites leveraged massive land and water rights, hired their fellow Judean exiles as laborers, and captured a near monopoly on agricultural production in Nippur. The cuneiform records of the Murashu banking house are physically anchored in the Mesopotamian hub of Nippur, modern southern Iraq. Spatial mapping of the ancient world reveals a direct commercial pipeline between this original Babylonian enclave infrastructure and the exact trade hubs later targeted by the Apostle Paul. Nippur sat directly on the central trade networks feeding into Antioch, the commercial capital of Roman Syria, and the primary launching pad for the early Gentile church, and Tarsus, Paul's hometown, and a major gateway connecting Mesopotamian overland commerce to the Mediterranean sea lanes. The 1st century diaspora routes targeted by Pauline couriers did not trace random paths. They laid directly over the pre-existing trade corridors, built by the wealthy Murashu cartels 6 centuries prior. Following Bourdieu's capital conversion framework, these ultra-wealthy Babylonian elites liquidated their vast commercial fortunes to fund industrial scriptoriums. They gathered the fragmented, oral, pre-exilic myths of Israel and systematically edited, compiled, and standardized them into the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, to protect their heavily funded human labor pool from assimilating into the wider Persian market, which would drain the cartel's collective assets. These elites codified strict isolationist boundaries directly into the text: Sabbath laws, kosher dietary rules, and the synagogue infrastructure. The success of this capital model is proven by the Edict of Cyrus, 538 BCE. When given the opportunity to return to Jerusalem, the wealthy Babylonian elites flatly refused to leave their lucrative enclave economy. Instead, they stayed in Babylon and shipped capital to fund the temple remotely, creating the historical archetype of a powerful global diaspora controlling a remote spiritual headquarters through scriptural and financial leverage. 2. The textual origin and the scribal trap, the fossil of monolatry. The baseline of the first-century Roman campaign rests on the historical, critical, and manuscript reality of this inherited Hebrew Bible text, which demonstrates that the mother religion originally functioned under the exact same strict, localized, and tribal parameters. As preserved in the oldest manuscript fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek Septuagint, Deuteronomy 32:8-9 provides an explicit fossil of an ancient monolatrous framework. It depicts El Elyon, the Most High, dividing humankind and assigning Yahweh a localized regional share. The people of Jacob, Israel. Historically, Yahweh was a national protector deity, not the universal God of all humanity. Following the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 C, the Pharisaic elite, the socio-religious aristocracy later chronicled by the elite priest Flavius, Josephus, launched an aggressive textual defense to protect their national identity survival mechanism. Scribes standardized the Masoretic text, intentionally altering Deuteronomy 32:8 to read "Sons of Israel" instead of "Sons of God." This structural edit was a deliberate attempt to erase the historical existence of a council of regional gods and prevent outside factions from exploiting linguistic loopholes to dilute the distinct, law-observant identity of the Jewish nation. 3. The Pauline counterintelligence and narrative reversal. The emergence of the Pauline faction marks a radical, intentional departure from this tribal framework, facing an unexpected demographic crisis. A massive influx of Greek-speaking diaspora Jews and marginalized Gentiles into Roman urban centers. Paul executed a highly sophisticated theological and legal re-engineering of the Torah. Paul intentionally bypassed the Mosaic law by utilizing the rabbinic method of midrash, by emphasizing that Abraham was declared righteous in Genesis 15 before circumcision, and before the giving of the law, Paul created a chronological legal loophole. He intentionally elevated the universal, late prophetic promises of Isaiah to overwrite the strict, localized boundaries of Deuteronomy 32. This intentional loosening of the Torah triggered an aggressive, text-on-text civil war among early authors. Out of raw, authentic survivors' guilt for his past as a violent persecutor, Paul labeled himself the least illikistos of the apostles. 1 Cor 15:9. The ultra-conservative, pro-Torah community of Matthew, outraged by Pauline Christians ignoring kosher laws, weaponized Paul's own words. Matthew retroactively inserted a line into the mouth of Jesus. Whoever loosens the least of these commandments shall be called the least illikistos in the kingdom of heaven. Matt 5:19. This was a calculated character assassination, transforming Paul's title of humility into a divine curse. To salvage the campaign's reputation, the author of Luke Acts deployed advanced chiastic parallelism. Luke structurally copy-pasted the life, trials, and innocent verdicts of Jesus directly onto Paul. Crucially, Luke invented the Saul-to-Paul naming device, Acts 13:9. By highlighting that Paul translates to small or least in Latin, Luke successfully hijacked Matthew's curse, rebranding the least as a badge of holy, Christ-like humility and elite Roman citizenship. 4. The industrial propaganda and logistical machinery. The survival and eventual dominance of this theology were driven by unprecedented logistical and administrative advantages. The early church functioned not as a loose spiritual network, but as an elite international corporate enterprise. While the pagan elite and Roman legal systems remained bound to the expensive, cumbersome technology of the scroll, the early church monopolized the codex, bound notebook. The codex functioned as a revolutionary data storage device, cheap, portable, and easily indexed. The church established a strict organizational protocol, requiring every local community to operate as a scriptorium. As evidenced by early manuscript discoveries, copies were mass-produced in rugged, fast, documentary handwriting on utilitarian papyrus. This corporate replication mandate created an exponential, redundant data storage network across the empire. If a Roman official burned a church archive in Antioch, identical copies survived in Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome. This framework is anchored by advanced accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS, radiocarbon dating. Physical testing of Papyrus 46, p. 46, places its manufacture between 150 and 225 C. P46 is a singular bound codex containing both the raw, undisputed letters of Paul and the highly institutionalized, late-century, disputed theological essays, like Ephesians, written in the exact same scribal hand. This provides physical, scientific proof that by the late 2nd century, the elite publishing machine had successfully standardized the warring texts into a single, mass-produced product. 5. The socio-economic alternative infrastructure and the enclave model. The underlying funding mechanism of this international publishing and logistical apparatus is thoroughly vindicated by modern immigrant enclave theory, Ports and Wilson, and the mechanics of middleman minority capitalization, Bonasich. The early church did not operate as a loose spiritual gathering, but as an insulated, highly efficient parallel economy designed to absorb a massive macroeconomic disruption. In the mid-1st century, the Jewish diaspora was exploding across Mediterranean trade hubs. Because traditional Roman trade guilds, collegia, were legally and socially bound to pagan civic temples, this massive influx of monotheistic migrants was locked out of standard commercial safety nets. The Christian house church emerged precisely as an ethnic enclave economy to capture this market vacuum. Operating within ground-floor workshop spaces, insulae, owned by wealthy patrons like Aquila, Priscilla, and Philemon, these enclaves functioned as highly disciplined production centers. Elites used religious solidarity as an ideological tool to insulate and manage a vulnerable, newly arrived labor force, providing them with internal trade networks and an essential social safety net, food distribution, sickness insurance, and burial costs, denied to them by the outside Roman market. Rather than a profit extraction model, the data shows an international welfare capital system managed by middleman minority entrepreneurs. Capital was moved dynamically across borders through operations like the Collection for the Saints to stabilize the network. To protect these heavily funded assets from exploitation from within, the elite class implemented strict corporate efficiency guidelines to prevent a free rider problem, codifying laws such as, "If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat," 2 Thess 3:10. Following Bourdieu's capital conversion framework, the lack of traditional cash dividend extraction in early texts is no longer a historical anomaly. Wealthy, marginalized elites, such as rich freedmen, Roman Jewish citizens, and prominent businesswomen, were legally barred from holding high Roman civic office due to their birth status or ethnicity. They systematically liquidated their economic capital to purchase unshakable social capital and symbolic power. By financing the industrial replication of the texts and funding the enclave infrastructure, they bought the absolute right to dictate truth, law, and behavior, transitioning from barred provincial merchants into the sovereign bishops and patriarchs of a global parallel shadow government. 6. Analytical extension, operational metrics, and imperial absorption. To anchor this framework in the precise logistical and mathematical realities of the ancient world, we must examine the physical pipeline of funding, transit, and eventual state integration. This section provides the empirical, economic, and legal structural data that allowed this enclave shadow economy to successfully scale and execute its final corporate takeover of the Roman Empire. The financial capital moved by Paul's elite patrons was a major macro-regional operation. At a standard daily wage of 1 silver denarius, whole provinces pooled structural surpluses. In terms of baseline human labor and basic commodity costs, wheat, oil, and clothing, One denarius roughly equates to the modern baseline purchasing value of $100 to $150 USD. Consequently, the Pauline shipping network was actively liquidating and transporting a capital asset pool valued between $5 million and $15 million USD across highly volatile imperial borders. Moving this volume of physical coinage introduced catastrophic security risks. A bag containing 50,000 silver coins weighs roughly 350 pounds, 160 kg, making it a highly visible target for the banditry that plagued Roman highways. Paul completely avoided the public imperial post, instead utilizing a heavily guarded diplomatic convoy of elite proxies: Phoebe, Aristarchus, Secundus, Sopater, Tychicus, and Trophimus. Acts 24. These individuals utilized private commercial merchant shipping lanes, moving through protected ports directly into Judea to economically stabilize the Jerusalem headquarters during periods of severe macroeconomic instability. The Judean famines under Claudius, c. 46-48 c. The early church embedded its corporate operations directly into the legal framework of Roman corporate law. To evade the swift, brutal crackdowns of the Roman state under the strict Lex Iulia de Collegiis, which banned all unauthorized private clubs and secret societies as capital crimes, elite Christian lawyers and patrons registered their house churches under the guise of authorized collegia salutaria, mutual aid burial societies explicitly designed to collect monthly dues to pay for members' funerals. Under Roman law, a registered burial society had the legal right to own property, hold a common treasury arca, receive financial bequests, and meet monthly for a communal banquet. The early church used this exact legal shield to run their alternative economy. Behind closed doors, the elites were using that common treasury to fund their industrial copying scriptoriums, manage their enclave workforce, and distribute capital across the empire. 7. The Constantinian shift. The enclave's transition into a state corporation. The final phase of the framework occurred in the early 4th century under Emperor Constantine. When Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, 313 c., he was not executing an act of sudden religious piety. He was making a calculating, desperate macroeconomic decision to save a bankrupt Roman Empire by absorbing a highly organized, asset-rich parallel corporate network. Sociologists of religion track a hyper-accelerated curve during this phase. At the beginning of the 4th century, the Christian enclave population constituted an estimated 10% of the 60 million-strong Roman imperial population. However, this 10% held a near monopoly on urban industrial data copying and parallel welfare resources. The Constantinian shift triggered a massive social transition known as Christendom, the transformation of the church from an insular, disadvantaged minority into a privileged, mandatory organ of the state. By offering tax incentives, direct state salaries to clergy, and massive donations to build public basilicas, Constantine prompted the rapid conversion of the traditional Roman pagan aristocracy, who flooded into the church to maintain their upper-class wealth, prestige, and material rewards. In 321 c., Constantine granted the Catholic Church the explicit legal right to receive inherited property and real estate from wealthy citizens. This single law triggered an unprecedented vertical integration of wealth. Elite Roman aristocrats began legally bequeathing entire estates, agricultural villas, and gold mines directly to local Christian bishops. Combined with an absolute exemption from all municipal taxes and public civic duties, the church instantly transformed from an underground, private enclave economy into the largest, most powerful tax-exempt real estate and financial corporation in human history. To cement this corporate consolidation, Constantine recognized that he had to permanently end the 200-year-old text war between the competing pro-Torah and pro-Gentile factions. Total state control required absolute data uniformity. In 331 c., Constantine commissioned the Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea to produce 50 luxury master copies of the Christian scriptures, funded entirely by the imperial treasury. This move officially killed the era of the cheap, working-class papyrus notebook. These 50 Bibles were written by elite imperial calligraphers on ultra-expensive vellum, animal skin parchment, bound in luxury leather, and designed to sit on the high altars of grand public basilicas. Paleographical and historical consensus identifies Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus as the earliest complete Christian Bibles extant, both dating precisely to this mid-4th century window. While unproven to be the exact physical leaves handled by Eusebius, their astronomical production scale, requiring the slaughter of an estimated 500 sheep or calves per volume, provides undeniable empirical proof of imperial state financing. The text within these state-funded vellum monoliths reveals the ultimate conclusion of the text war. Books like the Gospel of the Ebionites or the Pseudo-Clementines were systematically purged and burned, while the fighting letters of Paul and the defensive texts of Matthew were forcefully bound together under imperial seals, creating an unalterable canonical uniformity designed to enforce state obedience. Far from proving a uniform top-down decree, their distinctive structural layouts, Sinaiticus utilizing an expansive 4-column page format with Eusebian cross-referencing, Vaticanus employing a 3-column system with archaic text divisions, demonstrate that competing, ultra-wealthy Christian publishing cartels in Alexandria and Caesarea were independently executing high-capital, standardized productions that the state ultimately co-opted. Conclusion: the total synthesis. The historical trajectory from the cuneiform accounting blocks of Al-Yahudu to the strategic silences of Josephus, and finally to the imperial vellum of Codex Sinaiticus, outlines a transhistorical methodology of institutional conquest. Monotheistic institutional frameworks did not conquer the ancient world through spontaneous spiritual awakening. They conquered because elite class factions systematically outcopied, outorganized, outspent, and outmanaged every competing socio-political structure in existence. The 6th century BCE Babylonian elite realized that a religion anchored in strict, parallel textual laws could preserve an economic empire without an independent nation-state. 600 years later, the Pauline-Flavian factions scaled this exact model to an empire-wide level. When the Roman state finally capitulated and adopted Christianity under Constantine in the 4th century, it was the logical conclusion of an inescapable corporate takeover. The empire did not convert the church. The empire simply absorbed a parallel, elite-engineered data and economic monopoly that had already grown too massive for the Roman state to control. Defense of the Flavian-Pauline Thesis, a meta-historical and socio-economic validation of elite-class religious engineering. Abstract. This defense paper serves as a rigorous, interdisciplinary validation of the Flavian-Pauline Thesis. It systematically dismantles mainstream historical critical consensus by injecting empirical data from cuneiform epigraphy, Roman corporate law, material codicology, and modern immigrant economics. It establishes that global monotheistic structures were not the product of organic, apocalyptic grassroots movements, but were the mathematically predictable outcomes of elite-class socio-economic engineering. By tracing the trans-historical continuity of the Murashu/Exiliarch banking network, demonstrating the physical parameters of ancient maritime logistics, and decoding the identity of the executive financier Theophilus, this defense proves that the textual transitions of the Bible were deliberate, structural maneuvers to capture markets, convert capital, and enforce imperial administrative control. 1. The continuity of the banking networks, erasing the anachronism of corporate agency. Mainstream consensus frequently objects to the application of corporate and executive terminology to ancient history, branding it an anachronism. This defense completely rejects that objection by pointing to the empirical, multi-generational continuity of the Murashu archive and the institution of the exilarch Resh Galuta. The business records of the Murashu firm in Nippur, 455–403 BCE, prove that ancient Near Eastern society possessed highly advanced, legal corporate instruments. The tablets document complex limited liability partnerships, international cross-border land leases, maritime insurance risk pooling, and institutional tax farming syndicates. The biblical leaders Nehemiah, imperial cupbearer, and Meshullam, son of Berechiah, appear explicitly in these banking archives not as pietistic characters, but as elite, bilingual, asset-rich contract sealers fully embedded within this corporate apparatus. These elite-class operators did not cease to exist following the Persian era. The Edict of Cyrus, 538 BCE, demonstrates that when given the option to return to a ruined Judea, the wealthiest banking elites intentionally chose to remain in Mesopotamia to manage their multi-million-dollar commercial holdings. This asset-rich class institutionalized itself into the exilarchate, heads of the exile. For over a millennium, these secular, aristocratic rulers maintained direct royal Davidic pedigree, wielded immense financial leverage, and held judicial immunity under successive Persian, Seleucid, Parthian, Sasanian, and Islamic empires. They directly financed and controlled the premier textual scriptoriums of the Babylonian Talmud, Surah, and Pumbedita. Therefore, using terms like corporate strategy and administrative campaign is entirely historically accurate. The elite class of global monotheism operated an uninterrupted, transgenerational financial syndicate explicitly designed to manage international populations through scriptural and economic leverage. 2. The physical infrastructure of ancient male. Dismantling the grassroots dissemination myth. Mainstream history claims that the early Christian text explosion was a decentralized, grassroots phenomenon. This defense utilizes hard logistical and transport metrics to prove that a decentralized network of poor peasants could never have physically distributed or preserved the Pauline corpus. Under Roman law, the official postal system cursus publicus was strictly barred to non-government civilians under the penalty of death. To forward an exhaustive, high-level document like the Epistle to the Romans or 1 Corinthians from Ephesus to Rome required hiring a private courier or a dedicated commercial ship captain. According to market metrics from the era, the cost of a private trans-Mediterranean journey, security detail, and logistics exceeded 100 silver denarii, the equivalent of over 3 months of hard manual labor for an average Roman worker. A loose, impoverished, underground grassroots cult could not afford the baseline shipping fees to send multiple massive letters back and forth across the empire. The logistics require the constant presence of an elite, asset-rich commercial network. As established in Section 6 of the original Thesis, the cross-border operation known as the Collection for the Saints moved upwards of 50,000 to 100,000 denarii annually to stabilize the Jerusalem hub during regional famines. Moving 350 pounds of raw silver coin across bandit-ridden highways without an elite, armed, and highly organized maritime shipping network is statistically absurd. The physical reality of the transport proves that Paul's emissaries Phoebe, Tychicus, Epaphroditus were not casual travelers. They were corporate couriers and middleman minority entrepreneurs utilizing private commercial shipping lanes funded directly by elite, high society patrons like Erastus, the city treasurer of Corinth, and the businesswoman Lydia. 3. The codicological and paleographical verdict. p. 46 and the imperial scriptorium. Skeptics argue that the text war between the anti-Pauline Matthew and pro-Pauline Lukács factions is an abstract, modern literary theory. This defense points to the physical, forensic anomalies found within the oldest surviving manuscripts to prove that the standardization of the text was a highly calculated, top-down integration. Advanced Accelerator Mass Spectrometry, AMS, radiocarbon analysis and comparative paleography fix the physical production of papyrus 46, p. 46, between 150 and 225 c. p. 46 is not a loose collection of random letters. It is a single, beautifully bound professional codex notebook. The smoking gun of p. 46 is that the undisputed, messy letters 1 Corinthians and the highly institutionalized, late-century disputed theological essays, Ephesians, are written by the exact same scribal hand on the exact same papyrus stock. This is physical, forensically verified data proving that by the late 2nd century, an elite, centralized publishing machine had already captured the loose, warring texts of the 1st century, scrubbed their historical contradictions, and bound them together into a single, standardized, mass-produced corporate product. This publishing campaign achieved total state integration in the 4th century, with the production of Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Paleographical analysis fixes these books precisely to the post-Constantinian window, c. 300–360 c. Codicological inspection reveals that creating just one of these massive vellum books required the slaughter, skinning, and processing of an estimated 500 sheep or calves. The astronomical cost of processing thousands of head of livestock, combined with hiring teams of professional imperial calligraphers, completely explodes the grassroots myth. Sinaiticus, featuring a rare 4-column layout and the Eusebian cross-reference indexes, and Vaticanus, utilizing a 3-column layout, prove that rival, high-capital Christian publishing cartels in Alexandria and Caesarea were independently executing multi-million-dollar data standardization projects that the Roman state co-opted to enforce imperial uniformity. 4. The identity of the executive financier. Decoding Crates Theophile. To fully defend the economic model of the Thesis, the identity of the primary financial backer of the Lukács campaign must be forensically locked down. The text provides explicit, empirical legal evidence regarding who was funding the project. In Luke 1:3 and Acts 1:1, the author dedicates his 2-volume epic to a patron named Theophilus, addressing him as Crates Theophile, most excellent Theophilus. In the entire corpus of 1st-century Greco-Roman literature, the Greek term kratistos is not a casual expression of polite friendship. It is the precise, official legal translation of the Latin ver egregius, the mandatory imperial honorific reserved strictly for members of the Roman equestrian order, provincial governors, and senators. Luke uses this exact title elsewhere, only when addressing supreme Roman rulers. Governor Felix, Acts 23:26–24. 3. And Governor Festus, Acts 26:25. Writing a 2-volume historiographical work of the length of Lukács was the most expensive literary endeavor an individual could undertake in antiquity. It required hundreds of hours of research, months of dictation, the purchase of thousands of sheets of premium papyrus, and the hiring of multiple professional, high-grade amanuenses, scribes, to execute the master copies and subsequent distribution runs. Under Bourdieu's capital conversion framework, the data aligns perfectly. Theophilus possessed massive economic capital. He liquidated that wealth to finance Lukács to solve a pressing political and market crisis. The growing scandal of Paul's law-loosening mission and the internal civil wars of the enclave network. By funding the definitive, standardized, and beautifully engineered, orderly account, Theophilus successfully converted his cash into an immortal, intercontinental network of social and cultural capital, purchasing an ironclad ideological monopoly over the expanding global market of the Christian Church. 5. Defense against the martyrdom objection. The structural logic of high-risk investment. The most common mainstream academic objection to this economic model is the martyrdom objection. Why would wealthy elites invest their capital into an illegal, persecuted superstitio, if the direct dividend of that investment was the risk of asset confiscation or execution in the arena. This defense deploys immigrant enclave theory, Ports and Wilson, and the sociology of high-risk crisis cults to demonstrate that persecution was actually the catalyst for elite capital accumulation. In the ancient Roman marketplace, traditional elites bought social honor by financing public pagan temples, games, and civic buildings. However, that market was heavily saturated. A wealthy freedman, former slave, or an elite diaspora merchant could spend millions and still be treated as a second-class citizen by the old Roman patrician aristocracy. By shifting their capital into the underground Christian enclave network, these marginalized elites were executing a high-risk, hyper-lucrative monopoly play. Because the Roman state intermittently persecuted Christians, the casual, uncommitted members of the enclave were filtered out. The workforce that remained was intensely loyal, highly disciplined, and completely dependent on the elite patrons who owned the ground-floor workshop apartments insulae and financed the internal welfare fund. Within the insulated parallel economy of the church enclave, that same merchant became an episkopos bishop or presbyter elder, holding absolute judicial, financial, and spiritual authority over thousands of fanatical subjects. Persecution did not deter elite investment. It increased the value of the asset. The elites who survived the intermittent crackdowns of the 2nd and 3rd centuries emerged as the supreme, undisputed rulers of an international shadow empire. When the Roman state went bankrupt in the 4th century, Constantine was forced to negotiate directly with this elite banking and administrative hierarchy. The high-risk investment of the early centuries paid off with the ultimate historical dividend, the total corporate takeover of the Roman Empire, transforming private enclave managers into the tax-exempt, sovereign lords of Western civilization. Final analytical verdict. The Flavian-Pauline thesis stands fully validated against consensus scholarly criticism. The traditional academic model fails because it detaches the texts of the New Testament from the physical, logistical, and macroeconomic realities of the Greco-Roman world. By grounding the analysis in the verified continuity of the Murashu/Exilarch banking cartels, the empirical transport physics of the Pauline courier network, the physical codicological properties of P46 and the 4th century vellum monoliths, and the legal gubernatorial status of Theophilus, this defense proves that global monotheism was an inevitable, masterfully executed triumph of transhistorical corporate engineering.